There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the world you knew ceases to exist. Not with a bang, not with an announcement, but with a decision made in a room most people will never enter, by men who believe history bends to their will. That moment happened, and most of the world is only now beginning to understand what it means. In the spring of 2025, the United States of America launched a war against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let that land. Not a skirmish, not a targeted strike on a single facility, a war. Stealth bombers crossing into Iranian airspace, naval assets repositioned across the Persian Gulf, a president standing at a podium and telling the Iranian people, it will be yours to take. 6 American service members are already dead. Oil markets are convulsing. Shipping routes that carry a third of the world's energy supply are under threat. And in the war rooms of Beijing, Moscow, Riyadh, and Tel Aviv, analysts are staring at screens, running calculations, and reaching the same terrifying conclusion. Nobody is fully in control of what happens next. Think about that. The most powerful military force in human history has entered a conflict, and 1 week in, it cannot answer the most basic question any nation must answer before it sends its sons and daughters into harm's way. What is the objective? Picture the briefing rooms, the situation rooms, the marble corridors of power where the fate of nations is debated in hushed, urgent tones. In Washington, Pentagon officials are fielding calls from allied governments asking for clarity on the mission. The answers they're getting don't match. One day the goal is degrading Iran's military capacity. The next day, it's regime change. The day after that, it's something closer to Venezuela. Not toppling a government, just arresting 2 people. Perfect, the president called it. In Jerusalem, Benjamin Netanyahu is watching the war unfold like a man who has waited 40 years for this moment. And if you want to understand his strategy, it is the opposite of unclear. It is methodical, ruthless, brilliant even. Israeli strikes are not merely hitting military targets. They are decapitating Iran's leadership structure, destroying police facilities, dismantling the apparatus of state control piece by piece, brick by brick. The Wall Street Journal described it plainly. Israel is methodically destroying Iran's police state. And in Tehran, in the marble halls and underground bunkers of a regime that has survived 45 years of sanctions, assassinations, and isolation, the calculation is different entirely. This is not a war they believe they can win militarily. But they don't need to win militarily. They need to survive. And to survive, they are doing the only thing a cornered regime can do. They are making the entire world feel the pain. Here is the central truth that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. This war began without an exit strategy. That is not a political accusation. It is a strategic fact. And it was stated plainly with extraordinary candor by one of the most respected national security voices in America. Jake Sullivan, the man who served as President Biden's national security advisor, who sat in the Situation Room for 4 years, who helped negotiate the original Iran nuclear deal in 2015, he said it in terms that should make every American stop cold. The administration has not been able to say with any clarity whatsoever what the ultimate goal of this war is. 1 week in, a completely unclear objective. This is not rhetoric. This is not partisan criticism. This is a former national security advisor describing what he sees when he looks at the architecture of this conflict, and what he sees is a war launched before it was thought through. But that's not even the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part is something more subtle, something more structural, something that, once you understand it, changes how you see everything that's happening in the Middle East right now. The two countries waging this war, the United States and Israel, do not share the same goal. Let that sink in. They are flying sorties together. They are coordinating strikes together. American and Israeli military assets are operating in proximity in a theater of active conflict. And yet, at the strategic level, they want fundamentally different outcomes. For Israel, this war is about one thing: the destruction of the Islamic Republic. Full stop. Netanyahu said it himself in a video he released to the world, that this conflict represents the culmination of a 40-year dream, not a strategic objective, a dream, a historical reckoning that has consumed Israeli security doctrine for nearly half a century. For Washington, at least officially, the goal is something more limited: degrade Iran's military, prevent nuclear escalation, a defanged Iran, not a destroyed one. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth specifically denied this was a regime change war. His senior aide echoed him. The goal, they said, was merely to obliterate Iran's military capability, much of which, they noted, was already obliterated in a 12-day bombing campaign last June. But then something shifted. Trump reached out to Kurdish leaders in Iran and Iraq, promising them support if they joined the fight. That is not a military degradation operation. That is regime change. That is potentially a redrawing of Iran's borders. And then the weekend came, and Trump backpedaled. And then, in perhaps the most extraordinary statement of this entire conflict, the president declared that there would be no deal without Iran's unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender. The last time the United States demanded unconditional surrender from an adversary, it ended with nuclear bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki and a decade-long occupation of Japan. So the goal isn't regime change, except when it is. The goal is military degradation, except when it isn't. There will be a negotiated deal, except when there won't be. One of America's most respected Iran scholars, Karim Sajjadpour, reached for the only metaphor that captured it: regime change by jazz improvisation. The President of the United States is improvising a war against one of the most complex nations on earth, with a regional partner whose goals may be incompatible with American interests, with a clearly articulated American strategic objective nowhere in sight. And the world is watching. Now picture Tehran's response. Put yourself in the shoes of the Iranian regime. You are being pummeled from the air by the most sophisticated military technology on the planet. Your nuclear sites are burning. Your generals are being hunted. Your police state, the network of surveillance and coercion that has held your government together for 4 decades, is being systematically dismantled from 30,000 feet. What do? You don't fight back militarily. You can't. Not symmetrically. Not against the combined air power of the United States and Israel. But you have other instruments, and you are not afraid to use them. Iran has spent 30 years building networks of influence, disruption, and asymmetric leverage across the entire Middle East and beyond. Houthi proxies in Yemen, Hezbollah assets in Lebanon and beyond, supply chain vulnerabilities in the Strait of Hormuz that, if activated, affect not just American consumers but every economy on earth that runs on oil. And now they are activating them. What we are seeing: the strikes on energy infrastructure, the disruptions to shipping lanes, the coordinated pinprick attacks across multiple countries. This is not terrorism. This is strategy. Deliberate, calculated, purposeful strategy designed to achieve a single objective: make the cost of this war high enough, fast enough, that the American public and American allies demand it ends. Daniel Yergin, perhaps the world's foremost authority on global energy markets, wrote in the Financial Times that what is happening right now represents the largest disruption in oil production and transport in history, the largest in history. Gas prices in America have jumped dramatically in 1 week, and they are promised to go higher. Let that sink in. An adversary that cannot match American military power is reaching into your wallet, into your gas tank, into your morning commute, into the grocery store where the price of everything that was trucked to a shelf is about to go up. This is the Iranian playbook, and the Trump administration, according to Jake Sullivan, should have anticipated it before the first bomb fell. If you launch a kind of existential war against Iran, Sullivan said, don't be surprised if they have an existential response. For years, a man has been warning about something most people didn't want to hear. He is not a politician. He is not a general. He is not a diplomat or a think tank analyst or a cable news commentator. He is Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the most successful hedge funds in human history. A man who has spent decades studying not just markets, but the deeper patterns underneath markets, the tidal forces of history that determine which nations rise, which decline, and why. For years, Dalio has been articulating a thesis that cuts through the noise of daily politics and asks a more fundamental question: where are we in the great cycle of empires? He studied the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire, the rise of China. And what he found across centuries, across cultures, across radically different political systems is that the same patterns repeat over and over and over again. Great powers rise on the back of productivity, innovation, and institutional trust. They build reserve currencies. They construct alliance networks. They project military power. They write the rules of the international order and benefit disproportionately from those rules. And then gradually, then suddenly, the erosion begins. It starts with debt. Enormous unsustainable debt accumulated during decades of prosperity. It continues with internal division, a nation increasingly polarized, unable to agree on basic facts, let alone basic policy. It accelerates with what Dalio calls the loss of the reserve currency status, the moment when the world begins to question whether the dollar, the ultimate expression of American power, deserves its privileged position. And it culminates in Dalio's framework with a moment of overreach, a moment when a declining power, still believing in the myth of its own invincibility, takes an action that exposes the gap between its self-image and its actual capacity. Look at what is happening right now and tell me that doesn't feel disturbingly familiar. America has launched a war against one of the most complex geopolitical environments on Earth without a clear objective, without allied consensus, without a plan for the day after, with a president who is improvising strategy by the hour, with 6 soldiers already dead and no articulated definition of what their sacrifice is meant to achieve. This is not the America that rebuilt Europe after World War II. This is not the America that constructed the post-war international order. This is not the America whose word was its bond, whose alliances were its strength, whose institutional credibility was the invisible architecture on which global stability rested. This is something different, something more fragile, something that looks, to those who study history, like a power in transition, not yet in decline, but no longer what it was. Dalio would tell you this is the moment to pay attention, because the transitions between great power cycles are not announced. They do not arrive with a formal declaration. They accumulate in decisions like this one, in credibility deficits like this one, in strategic incoherence like this one, until one day the world wakes up and realizes that the map has changed. We may be living inside that accumulation right now. Walk around the world for a moment, because the consequences of what is happening in the Persian Gulf are not confined to the Persian Gulf. In Europe, governments that depend on Middle Eastern oil flows are watching their energy security calculations fall apart in real time. The continent spent the last 3 years rebuilding its energy infrastructure after Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered the comfortable assumptions of the post-Cold War order. And now, just as those new pipelines were being laid, those new LNG terminals were coming online, another energy shock is materializing from another direction. European leaders are making calls, holding emergency sessions, asking the fundamental question that no one wanted to ask 3 weeks ago. Can we rely on Washington to be a predictable strategic partner? That question would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. In Asia, China is watching, and China is learning. Not from the military operations themselves. China has studied American military doctrine for decades. It is learning something more valuable. It is learning that the United States, under certain conditions, can be strategically incoherent. It is watching the gap between American power and American strategy. And in Beijing, that gap is a data point in a much larger calculation about Taiwan, about the South China Sea, about the moment, if it comes, when China decides to test the commitment of American allies in Asia. America's Arab allies, the Gulf states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, are in an exquisitely uncomfortable position. They quietly welcomed Israeli and American action against Iran. The Islamic Republic has been a destabilizing force across the region for decades. They would be pleased, relieved even, to see it defanged. But defanged is very different from destroyed, and destroyed is very different from chaos. Because these nations, their entire economic model, their entire social contract with their populations depends on stability, on predictable oil flows, on the ability to do business with the world without worrying that the region could collapse into an Iranian civil war that sends millions of refugees across borders and gives extremist groups the power vacuum they have been waiting for. They are watching Washington, and what they are seeing worries them. Let's talk about what the numbers are saying, because in the end, markets do not lie. Markets do not have political allegiances. Markets do not care who wins the argument on cable news. Markets are the aggregate judgment of millions of actors, investors, corporations, governments, sovereign wealth funds, each making their own calculation about the future. And the markets are sending a signal right now that demands attention. Oil prices spiked the moment the strikes began. That was expected. What was not expected, or should not have been, though clearly someone in the administration failed to anticipate it, was the speed and breadth of the disruption to global shipping lanes. Daniel Yergin's verdict in the Financial Times is not hyperbole. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes, is now a zone of active uncertainty. Insurance rates for tankers transiting the region have gone vertical. Some carriers are rerouting entirely, adding days and thousands of miles to journeys that used to be routine. And the cost of that, every cent of it, flows through to consumers. At the pump, in the grocery store, in every manufactured good that required energy to produce and fuel to ship. Investors are diversifying, not in panic, not yet, but with the deliberate, systematic diversification of people who have concluded that the risk profile of the Middle East has changed structurally. Gold is moving. Certain currencies are moving. The conversations happening in the boardrooms of sovereign wealth funds from Oslo to Singapore are not about what happens next week. They are about what happens over the next decade if this conflict reshapes the energy geography of the planet. And corporations, particularly those with deep supply chain exposure in the region, are already running contingency plans, running them quietly, but running them. The world is adjusting, not loudly, not in a way that makes headlines, but with the quiet, inexorable logic of self-interest that drives every economic actor on Earth when they sense that a familiar system is becoming unfamiliar. Here is the question that will define the next chapter of history. Not whether Iran's regime survives, not whether oil prices stabilize, not even whether American service members come home safely, though God willing they do. The question is what happens to the country after the regime. Because Israel, brilliant, focused, methodically executing a 40-year strategic vision, may actually succeed. The strikes are working, the police state is crumbling, the leadership is being decapitated. If this continues on its current trajectory, the Islamic Republic of Iran, a regime that has dominated the Middle East for 45 years, could collapse. And then what? Think about what Iran actually is. It is not a monolithic nation. It is a mosaic. Kurds in the northwest, with deep ties to Iraqi Kurdistan. Azeris in the northeast with cultural connections to Azerbaijan. Arabs in the south, Baloch in the east, and layered over this mosaic, a Revolutionary Guard of nearly 200,000 soldiers, armed to the teeth, ideologically committed, and with absolutely nothing to lose if the state that gave them power and purpose disappears. Think about the Besiege, the paramilitary force, hundreds of thousands strong, that has served as the regime's enforcers for decades. Think about the regular armed forces, 400,000 men under arms, whose institutional loyalty to any successor government is an open question. Now think about what happened in Iraq. Saddam Hussein's army melted away in the face of the American invasion. It dissolved, vanished. And then, over the months and years that followed, it reappeared, in different clothes, under different names, as an insurgency that consumed over 4,000 American lives and fundamentally destabilized a region that America is still trying to stabilize 2 decades later. The Iraq will not simply go home. Think about Libya. 14 years after Muammar Gaddafi was dragged from a drainage ditch and killed by a mob, 14 years, there is still no unified government controlling the entire country. 2 governments, multiple militias, an ongoing low-grade civil war that has made Libya a transit point for migrants and a playground for foreign powers. Tom Friedman, one of the most perceptive observers of Middle Eastern politics, has written about what Iran could become. It is filled, he notes, with ethnic groups who have lived peaceably together for decades. But as history demonstrates, from the Balkans to Rwanda to Iraq, when order collapses and a power vacuum develops, people retreat to their tribes, to their ethnic identities, to the ancient loyalties that no amount of national myth-making fully erases. That is how civil wars begin. An Iranian civil war would not be a regional problem. It would be a global catastrophe. It would send millions of refugees across borders already strained to their limits. It would ignite proxy conflicts drawing in Turkey, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. It would create a failed state of 89 million people sitting atop some of the world's most strategic real estate. And here, right here, is where the divergence between Israeli and American interests becomes not just a strategic complication, but a potentially catastrophic one. For Israel, a chaotic Iran may be an acceptable outcome. The Syrian civil war, tragic as it was for Syria, removed a major Arab state from the front lines of the conflict with Israel. A chaotic Iran achieves the same strategic result. The greatest threat to Israeli security is neutralized, not by building a better Iran, but by ensuring that Iran cannot threaten anyone at all. But America is not Israel. America has interests that extend across the entire region. America's Arab allies, the ones who depend on it for security, the ones who hold its debt, the ones whose energy production sustains the global economy, need stability. They need predictability. They need oil to flow, goods to move, money to transfer, and people to travel. A civil war in Iran destroys all of that. This is the razor's edge on which American strategy must now walk. Secure the gains, a defanged Iran, a degraded nuclear program, a reduced threat to regional partners, but stop short of the collapse. Find the line between degradation and destruction, and find it in the middle of an improvised war with a partner whose objectives diverge from yours, against an adversary that is playing for its survival, while the rest of the world watches and adjusts its alliances accordingly. Dalio would recognize this moment. It is the moment when the cost of strategic incoherence becomes undeniable. When the gap between power and wisdom, between the ability to project force and the ability to manage its consequences, determines whether a great power advances or begins its long retreat. The clock is running. There is still a path to a managed resolution. Jake Sullivan, the man who has sat in that situation room, who has navigated these exact pressures, believes Qatar could still play its traditional role as intermediary. Qatar has brokered deals in this region before. It has lines of communication into Tehran that Washington cannot maintain publicly. There is perhaps still a diplomatic window, but that window is closing. Every day this war continues. The Iranian regime makes more calculations about what its options are. Every day the strikes continue, the possibility of the regime's collapse, and with it, the chaos that follows grows. Every day the U.S. cannot articulate a clear objective. The credibility of American strategic commitment frays a little further in the minds of allies from Warsaw to Tokyo. At some point, and no one knows when, but everyone who studies these conflicts knows it is real. The war will reach a tipping point, the moment when neither side can control the escalation. When a miscalculation triggers a response that opens a front no one planned for. When the improvisation goes wrong in a way that cannot be walked back. This week, that tipping point does not appear to have been reached. But this week is not forever. History rarely announces its turning points in advance. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand did not feel, in the moment, like the beginning of a war that would kill 20 million people. The fall of the Berlin Wall did not feel, in the moment, like the end of a 40-year global order. The attacks of September 11th did not feel in the initial hours like the opening act of 2 decades of war. They only become turning points in retrospect, when we can see, looking backward, that the world was never the same after. We are in one of those moments right now, and the questions that will define the next decade are not the ones being debated on cable news. They are deeper, more fundamental, more historically consequential. Can the United States navigate a war it launched without a clear objective and come out the other side with its credibility intact? Or does the strategic incoherence of these weeks leave a scar in the minds of allies and adversaries alike that shapes every calculation for years to come? Can Israel achieve its 40-year dream of eliminating the Islamic Republic? And does achieving that dream produce a stable Middle East or a chaotic one? And if chaos follows, who pays the price? And perhaps the deepest question of all, the one that Dalio has been asking for years, the one that underlies everything we have discussed today. Is this moment an anomaly, a turbulent chapter in a story that ultimately resolves toward American-led stability? Or is it something more structural, more permanent, a data point in a longer arc that historians decades from now will identify as the beginning of the end of the post-war American order? The world is watching, and it is adjusting. The old certainties are crumbling. New alliances are forming in the shadows. The improvisation continues. And somewhere in Tehran, somewhere in Jerusalem, somewhere in Beijing and Moscow and Riyadh, someone is making a calculation right now that will determine what the world looks like when the smoke finally clears. The question is, does Washington have a plan for that world? Because history doesn't wait for the improvisation to catch up.